The city streets were cold and wet, rain falling without mercy. 3 alien widows stood together near the corner of a crowded market. They wore old clothes that no longer fit them well, and their hands shook as they held small wooden signs. The signs had only one message written in shaky human letters. "Please, we just need a job." People walked past quickly, their umbrellas hiding their faces. Some glanced at the widows, then turned away as if they were invisible. Others whispered cruel words, saying that aliens had no place among humans. A group of children even laughed, pointing fingers at their strange shapes and glowing eyes. But the widows stayed silent, their eyes lowered, because they had no strength left to argue. The first widow was tall and thin, her skin faintly blue, her face marked with scars of an old battle. She had once been proud, a soldier's wife who believed her husband would protect her forever, but the war had taken him away, leaving her with nothing but memories. The second widow was small, her silver hair tied in a rough knot, her eyes always wet with tears. She used to sing for her family, and her husband's laughter was her favorite sound. Now silence was her only companion. The third widow looked younger, but her heart was heavier. She had lost not only her husband, but also a child. And her grief made her stare into the distance as if the world no longer mattered. They had come to the human city with hope. They thought maybe someone would see their hard work and kindness. Maybe someone would let them wash dishes, clean floors, or carry heavy loads. They did not ask for gold. They did not ask for comfort. They only asked for the chance to survive. But every door they knocked on was slammed shut. Every shopkeeper shook his head. Every family said the same words: "No aliens, go away." The widows walked from street to street, their shoes torn, their stomachs empty. At night they slept under broken roofs, listening to the sound of human voices inside warm houses. They wrapped their thin blankets around each other, whispering soft words in their own alien language, words of courage, words of pain, words of hope. Sometimes they remembered their husbands, the brave soldiers who never returned. The images of fire, smoke, and the sound of weapons still burned in their minds. The war was over, but its shadow followed them everywhere. And now, even in peace, they were treated as enemies. One evening, as the sun sank behind tall buildings, the widows stood in the marketplace again. The crowd moved like a river, rushing and loud, but no one looked at them. The youngest widow's legs gave way and she fell to her knees. Her wooden sign slipped from her hand and lay flat in the mud. The words, "Please, we just need a job," were smeared by dirt and rain. The other 2 widows bent to lift her, their faces full of silent sorrow. They knew tomorrow would be the same, and the day after, and maybe forever. Still, none of them wanted to give up, because giving up meant death. And they had promised their husbands, in their final memories, that they would live, even if life was cruel, even if the world rejected them. They would live. The night grew darker, the lamps of the city glowing faintly. The widows stood under one of those lamps, their shadows long and thin. People hurried past, their faces blurred, their hearts closed. But somewhere in that busy crowd, a pair of human eyes watched quietly. The widows did not notice, too tired and too broken to care. But someone was watching, someone who did not laugh, someone who did not turn away. A man stood at the far side of the street. His coat was old, his face hidden under a hood. He had been watching the widows for days. He had seen their struggle, their hunger, their silent tears, and in his heart a question grew. Why had no one helped them? Why did the city act blind to their suffering? He took a step forward, then stopped. The rain fell harder, drumming against the ground. His eyes narrowed with a mix of sadness and decision. The widows, unaware, leaned on each other for support, whispering one last prayer to survive the night. The man clenched his fists and whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, I will speak to them." And with that silent promise, the night closed around them. The widows remained alone in their suffering. But in the darkness, a small spark of fate had been lit, a spark that would change everything. The next morning was gray and heavy, clouds covering the sky like a blanket. The widows woke up in the corner of an empty street, their bodies stiff from sleeping on cold stone. Their clothes were damp, their stomachs empty, their hearts heavy. They whispered to each other that they would try again. They would beg for any small job, even if it was only sweeping floors as a. They rose. A shadow stretched across them. The widows looked up in fear, expecting another cruel human ready to spit or curse, but the figure only stood silently, water dripping from the hood of his old coat. The first widow narrowed her eyes, her instincts sharp from a life of rejection. The second widow trembled, clutching the younger one close. The youngest widow stared with tired, hollow eyes, ready to run if needed. The man slowly removed his hood, revealing a weathered face, rough but calm. His eyes were not filled with hate nor with pity, but with something different, curiosity, and maybe kindness. "My name is Daniel," he said softly, his voice deep but gentle. The widows looked at each other, unsure how to answer. Daniel crouched down, so his eyes were level with theirs, and he spoke again. "I've seen you here, every day, in the rain, in the sun, standing with your signs. You ask only for work, but no one listens." His words cut deep because they were true. Tears welled in the eyes of the second widow, while the first widow clenched her fists, still suspicious. Daniel sighed and looked at the ground for a moment before continuing. "I have a farm outside the city," he explained. "It is not big, but the soil is good, and the house needs many hands to keep it alive. You can work there if you choose. I will give you food, shelter, and a place to rest." The widows froze, unable to believe what they heard. A job? A home? Could this be real? Or was it another cruel trap dressed as kindness? The first widow stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Why would you help us? No one else does." Her tone was filled with suspicion, but Daniel did not flinch. He met her eyes calmly and answered, "Because no one else will, and because I cannot watch you suffer any longer." The words were simple, but they carried weight. The widows felt both fear and hope twist inside them, a painful mix. The second widow asked quietly, her voice shaking, You will not hurt us? You will not sell us?" Daniel's eyes widened with surprise. "No," he said firmly. "I would never do such a thing." The youngest widow, silent until now, whispered, "If we go with you, will people come to chase us away again?" Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment his gaze darkened as if old memories returned. "No," he said, steadying his voice. "I will not let that happen." For a long time, silence hung in the air. The widows stared at him, studying his face, trying to see. If he lied, Daniel waited patiently, not pushing them, not rushing their decision. Finally, the first widow lowered her guard just slightly. "We will go," she said, though her voice carried both trust and doubt. The other two nodded, holding onto each other's arms, their bodies trembling. Daniel rose to his feet, his coat brushing against the wet ground. "Then come," he said, "the road is long, but it will lead to something better than this." They walked behind him, leaving the cruel city streets for the unknown path ahead. The crowd of humans barely noticed them leave, some muttering, some laughing, but none caring. The widows felt both relief and fear, relief that someone had finally spoken to them with respect, fear that this man might not be what he seemed. Hours later, as the city grew smaller behind them, the widows followed Daniel into the countryside. The air smelled cleaner, the fields stretched wide, and for the first time in weeks, the widows saw open sky without smoke or buildings. Their tired hearts felt a flicker of peace. Daniel walked, ahead carrying a small bag over his shoulder, silent but steady. Every step made the widows wonder more about him. Who was this man? Why did he choose them? Why risk his life to shelter alien widows no one wanted? At last, they reached the edge of a small farm. The house was old but strong, the fields wide and green. Animals grazed nearby, and the wind carried the smell of earth and grain. For the widows, it felt almost unreal, as if they had stepped into another world. Daniel turned to face them, his voice calm but serious. "This is your home now, if you wish it to be." The widows looked at one another, their hearts filled with both hope and unease, a place to belong at last. But what hidden truth waited within these walls? That night, as the widows lay in beds for the first time in many months, sleep came heavy but uneasy. They did not yet trust this human, not fully. And in the distance beyond the quiet farm, the sound of the wind carried a whisper of secrets not yet revealed. Because Daniel, the man who offered them kindness, was also a man with shadows in his past. And those shadows would soon rise again. The morning sun touched the small farm with soft light. The widows stood at the doorway of Daniel's old wooden house, looking around with wide eyes. The air smelled of fresh soil, the sound of birds filled the sky, and the wind carried peace they had not felt in years. For a moment it seemed like a dream, too good to be real. Daniel showed them the rooms, each with a small bed and a blanket. The house was simple, nothing grand, but compared to the cold streets of the city, it felt like a palace. The second widow ran her fingers across the wooden walls, whispering that she had almost forgotten what safety felt like. The youngest widow touched the bed, her eyes wet, unable to believe she could rest without fear of being chased away. The first widow, however, remained quiet, her sharp eyes scanning every corner. She had trusted no one since the war, and she was not ready to trust now. Daniel gave them bread and warm soup. The widows ate slowly at first, as if the food might be taken away. When Daniel saw this, he said softly, "Eat. There is more." For the first time, the widows ate until their stomachs were full, and they almost smiled. Almost, but not fully, because the shadow of doubt still lived in their hearts. After the meal, Daniel led them outside. He showed them the fields where tall grass moved in the wind. He explained how the soil was rich but needed work. The widows nodded, willing to work, because working was better than begging. Daniel gave them simple tasks: watering plants, feeding animals, cleaning tools. The widows moved quickly, their hands steady, their bodies strong from years of hardship. As the day passed, Daniel noticed something. These widows were not weak, they were survivors. And slowly, he felt something inside, himself, respect. Yet as night approached, the widows began to notice strange things. The house was old, but some parts looked unusual. Strange symbols carved into the beams, faded marks glowing faintly in the dark. The barn doors were locked with heavy chains. Even though Daniel claimed it was only for tools, at night, while the widows tried to rest, they heard sounds, low humming, almost like machinery echoing from the barn. The second widow whispered, "This place hides secrets." The first widow replied sharply, "I knew it. Nothing comes free." The youngest widow curled into her blanket, fear in her eyes. What if we made a mistake? The next day, Daniel spoke little. He worked in the fields, his back bent, his hands covered in dirt. But sometimes he looked at the barn with a face full of shadows. The widows noticed, and their unease grew stronger. Why lock a barn so tightly? Why guard it as if it held more than tools? The first widow began to watch Daniel closely. She studied his movements, his silence, his eyes when he thought no one was looking. She felt danger in the air. Like the calm before a storm, despite the fear, the farm gave them something they had not felt in months: hope. The second widow began to hum quietly while she worked, her voice soft, carrying across the fields. The youngest widow started smiling. Again, even if only for a short while, the first widow softened too, though she kept her guard high. They cleaned the house, repaired broken fences, and cooked meals together. The place began to feel alive, as if the widow's presence had breathed new spirit into it. But that night, when the moon was bright, the widows could not ignore the strange noises. The barn shook lightly, as if something inside was moving. Metal against metal. A faint light, seeping through the cracks in the wood. The widows gathered in their room, whispering in fear. "Should we ask him?" the second widow asked. "He will lie," the first widow said firmly. "What if he is dangerous?" the youngest whispered, her voice trembling. The room fell into silence, the truth heavy on their hearts. Later, when Daniel left the house, to fetch water, the first widow made a decision. "We must see what he hides," she said, her voice cold and steady. The second widow hesitated. "If he finds out, he already holds power over us." The first widow interrupted. "We must know if this man is savior or enemy." The youngest widow's hands shook, but she nodded. Together they stepped out into the cold night, their feet silent on the dirt. The barn loomed ahead, tall and dark, the chains glinting in moonlight. The widows moved closer, their hearts pounding like drums. The first widow touched the lock, testing it. It was heavy, but her alien strength gave her an edge. With effort, she broke it open, the sound sharp in the silence. The doors creaked as they pushed them slowly. The air inside was thick with dust and something else, something electric. The widows stepped inside, their eyes widening. Rows of strange machines stood in the shadows, glowing faintly. Alien weapons, battle armor, maps of star systems pinned to the walls. It was not the barn of a simple farmer. It was the storage of a man tied to war. The second widow gasped, covering her mouth. The youngest whispered in horror, He fought where our husbands died." The first widow's face hardened, her suspicion turning into certainty. "This man is not just a farmer, he is a soldier," she said, her voice shaking with rage and fear. The widows turned at the sound of footsteps. Daniel stood at the doorway, his eyes cold, his face unreadable. For a long moment silence filled the barn, heavy and sharp. The widows felt trapped, their secret exposed, their fate uncertain. Daniel stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the floor, and in a voice, low and firm, he said, "You should not have opened this door." The air inside the barn was heavy, filled with the faint smell of oil and old dust. The three widows stood frozen, their eyes wide with fear and anger. Behind them, the strange machines glowed faintly in the moonlight, weapons of war and broken armor stacked in piles. Before them stood Daniel, his face shadowed, his voice calm but sharp. "You should not have opened this door," he repeated. The first widow stepped forward, her hands clenched. "You lied," she said in a cold voice. "You said you were a farmer, but you are a soldier." Her eyes burned with rage, the memory of her husband's death flashing in her mind. The second widow trembled, tears running down her cheeks. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Were you one of the men who killed them? Were you there when our families died?" The youngest widow clutched her chest, shaking, unable to speak. For her, the sight of those weapons felt like the war had never ended. Daniel's eyes softened for a moment, but his jaw remained tight. "Yes, I fought," he admitted, his voice steady, "but not for the reasons you think." He walked past them, brushing his hand across one of the machines. "These weapons were not built to kill your people," he continued. "They were built to end the war. But I refused to use them the way my commanders wanted." The first widow scoffed bitterly. "Words are easy," she snapped. "We have heard many lies from human mouths." Daniel turned to face her, his eyes filled with a quiet fire. "I saved lives," he said firmly. "Not all, not enough. But I did not stand by while the innocent burned." He paused, his voice low with guilt. "I could not save your husbands, but I saved others like you, and that is why I keep these weapons here, not to use them, but because I cannot let them fall into cruel hands again." The barn fell silent. The only sound was the wind outside brushing against the wooden walls. The widows exchanged glances, torn between disbelief and a faint flicker of hope. Could he be telling the truth? Could this man, a soldier, really have been different from the others? The second widow wiped her tears and asked softly, "Then why hide it from us?" Daniel sighed, lowering his gaze. "Because I knew if you saw this, you would hate me before, knowing me," he said. "I wanted to give you peace, at least for a while." The first widow's anger softened slightly, though suspicion still burned in her eyes. The youngest finally spoke, her voice small and fragile. "If you are not like the others, then why help us at all?" Why risk your life for alien widows? Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then answered in a voice heavy with truth. Because I am tired of watching the world divide itself, tired of seeing innocent lives crushed. I could not save my brothers in war, but maybe I can save someone, now. The widows stood in silence, their hearts torn. They wanted to believe him, but pain ran deep. Trust was not something easily given, not after losing everything. Still, his words carried weight, more than empty promises. Suddenly, the quiet of the barn was broken. A sharp sound echoed outside. The distant growl of engines. Daniel's face darkened, his body stiffening. They found us, he muttered under his breath. The widows looked at him in shock, fear rushing through their veins. Who found us? The second widow asked, her voice shaking. Daniel moved quickly, pulling an old rifle from the wall. Soldiers, he said, his tone grim. The same men who wanted these weapons. They will not stop until they take them, and they will not spare you. The widows gasped, the youngest clutching the other's arm. The first widow stepped forward, her voice fierce. You brought us into danger, she hissed. We trusted you, and now they will kill us. Daniel shook his head, his voice firm. No, I will not. Let them. I brought you here because I knew this day would come, and I knew you would not survive in the city when it does. But here together, we have a chance. He moved to the barn doors, locking them tight. The glow of headlights cut through the night outside, shadows of soldiers moving across the fields. The widows felt their hearts race, their breaths quick and shallow. For the first time, they realized their lives were tied to Daniel's fate. Whether he was friend or enemy, he was the only shield they had now. Daniel turned back to them, his eyes burning with determination. You wanted the truth, and now you have it, he said. I am a soldier, yes, but I am also the man who will fight for you. His voice carried strength, but also a heavy sadness. The widows exchanged looks again, their fear shifting into something else. They had fought to survive alone, but maybe now they would have to fight together. Outside, the soldiers shouted, their voices sharp. Open the doors, Daniel, we know you're hiding them. The widows froze, their blood turning cold. Daniel raised his weapon, his jaw set. They will not take you, he said, his voice steady as steel. And for the first time, the widows believed him, if only a little. The night grew darker, the danger closer. The barn, once a place of secrets, had become a battlefield waiting to ignite, and within its walls, 3 widows and 1 human stood at the edge of a storm that would decide if trust was a gift or a deadly mistake. The night shook with angry voices outside the barn. The soldiers shouted Daniel's name, demanding he open the doors. Their boots crushed the grass, their weapons glimmered in the headlights of armored trucks. Inside, the widows huddled together, their hearts racing. Daniel stood in front of them, rifle in his hands, his body firm like a shield. The first widow's eyes blazed with anger. You brought danger to us, she said in a harsh whisper. We should never have trusted you. Daniel did not look at her, his gaze fixed on the barn doors. You are right, he answered quietly. I hid the truth, but I will not hide now. They will not harm you. The second widow trembled, clutching the youngest close. Her tears fell as she whispered, We cannot fight them. There are too many. Daniel turned his head slightly, his voice calm but full of steel. You have survived worse. You have survived war. Trust me one more time, and I promise I will protect you. The youngest widow shook her head, fear filling her voice. How can we trust you when you carry the same weapons that killed our families? Her words cut deep, and for a moment Daniel's eyes showed pain, but he raised his chin and spoke firmly. Because I carry guilt with me every day. I carry the weight of what happened. I cannot erase it, but I can choose who I fight for now, and tonight I fight for you. The widows fell silent, their hearts torn. Could a human soldier truly stand for them? Could the enemy of yesterday become the protector of today? The first widow's jaw tightened. She stepped closer, her voice sharp. If you betray us, I swear I will end you with my own hands. Daniel nodded, meeting her fierce gaze without fear. "Then hold me to that promise," he said. Outside, the soldiers banged on the barn doors. "Open or we burn it down," they shouted. Smoke bombs rolled under the cracks, hissing and filling the air with thick fumes. The widows coughed, their eyes stinging. Daniel quickly pulled them toward a trap door at the far end of the barn. "Follow me," he ordered. They hesitated for only a second, then ran after him. The trapdoor opened into a narrow tunnel, dark and damp. They crawled through, their hands scraping the earth, their breaths fast with panic. Above them, the barn shook as soldiers forced their way inside. The sound of wood splintering echoed through the tunnel. At last, they reached the other side, emerging behind a row of trees on the edge of the fields. The moonlight guided them as they stumbled out, gasping for air. The soldiers were busy tearing apart the barn, their voices rough, their anger rising. Daniel led the widows further into the shadows, whispering, "They will not stop until they find you. They believe you are dangerous." The second widow's voice trembled. "But we are not dangerous, we are only widows with nothing left." Daniel's jaw clenched, his voice low and bitter. "They do not care. To them you are symbols of fear, reminders of war. And people fear what they do not understand." The widows exchanged looks of despair. The youngest whispered, "Then where can we go? Where can we live?" Daniel looked out into the dark fields, his voice heavy. "You cannot run forever, but if we stand together, we can resist them." The first widow narrowed her eyes. "You ask us to fight with you, after everything we lost?" Daniel met her glare with steady resolve. "I do not ask you to fight for me," he said. "I ask you to fight for yourselves, for your right to live, for the families you lost, and for the peace you deserve." The widows fell into silence, their breaths heavy, their hearts conflicted. They had sworn never to fight again, never to raise their hands in violence after the war stole everything. But now the choice was laid bare: hide and wait for death, or fight and claim a chance at survival. The second widow squeezed the youngest hand, whispering, "We cannot lose each other too." The first widow placed a hand on her shoulder, her voice strong. "Then we fight, not for revenge, but because living is the only way to honor what we lost." The youngest widow looked between them, fear and courage clashing in her heart. Finally, she nodded, her voice soft but firm. "I will fight too." Daniel looked at them, his eyes full of respect. "You are stronger than you know," he said. "Stronger than any soldier out there." From his bag, he pulled out small alien devices he had hidden. "They once belonged to soldiers of your kind. I kept them safe." The widows stared in shock as he handed them each a piece of old technology. Weapons, but light and glowing, shaped for alien hands. The first widow held hers firmly, feeling both pain and power. The second widow hesitated, then gripped hers with trembling fingers. The youngest held hers close, whispering a promise to herself that she would use it only to protect. Daniel armed himself with his rifle, his voice steady. "They think you are weak, but tonight they will see the truth." From the distance, the sound of boots and shouts drew closer. The soldiers had discovered the tunnel, their lights cutting through the darkness. The widows stood side by side with Daniel, their shadows long under the moon. Their fear had not vanished, but it had turned into something else: determination. For the first time, trust had begun to form, not from words, but from shared danger. The night air grew tense, the world silent, and as the first soldier appeared at the edge of the trees, Daniel whispered, "Stay close. Stay strong. This is only the beginning." The night was quiet for only a heartbeat. Then shouts broke the silence. The soldiers spread out across the fields, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. The widows crouched behind the trees, their hearts beating like drums. Daniel knelt beside them, his rifle steady, his eyes sharp and cold. "They are coming fast," he whispered. "Be ready." The first widow gripped the strange alien weapon Daniel had given her. It hummed softly in her hands, as if alive. She took a deep breath, her anger and grief twisting into strength. The second widow trembled, her silver hair glowing faintly in the moonlight. She whispered a prayer under her breath, holding her weapon close. The youngest widow's hands shook, But she lifted her device, her eyes wet with both fear and courage. They were not warriors anymore, but survival demanded they fight again. The first wave of soldiers burst through the trees, their boots crushing leaves, their weapons raised. "Over there," one shouted, his voice sharp. Daniel fired first, his rifle cracking through the night. A soldier fell and chaos exploded. The widows gasped, the youngest covering her ears for a moment before forcing herself to focus. "Now!" Daniel shouted. "Feuer." First widow aimed a beam of blue light shot from her weapon, striking an enemy and sending him sprawling. The second widow hesitated, but when a soldier charged at her, she screamed and fired. The man was thrown back by a blast of force. The youngest widow closed her eyes for a second, then opened them with fierce resolve. She fired at the ground near approaching soldiers, creating a burst of energy that knocked them off their feet. Her voice shook as she cried out, "Stay away from us!" The soldiers regrouped, shouting orders. "Do not kill the widows. Take them alive." One of them barked. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his jaw tight. "They want you," he told the widows. "Alive or dead, they will not stop." The first widow snarled, "Then we make them stop." Gunfire roared. Energy blasts lit the night. The farm fields became a battlefield, dirt exploding under heavy boots, sparks flying as weapons clashed. The widows fought side by side with Daniel, their bodies moving with desperate strength. Every shot they fired carried the weight of their past. Every strike was a scream for survival, but the enemy was many, too many, and they kept coming. The second widow stumbled, her arm grazed by a bullet. She cried out, falling to her knees. The youngest rushed to her side, tears streaming. "No, stay with me," she begged, holding her. Tightly, Daniel fired over them, shouting, "Get her behind the rocks!" The first widow grabbed the second and pulled her to cover, fury burning in her chest. Her weapon blazed brighter than before, each shot fueled by rage. But the soldiers pushed harder. Grenades flew. Explosions tore holes in the earth. The farm animals scattered in terror. The barn burned in the distance, flames rising into the sky. Daniel shouted orders, guiding the widows. Moving like a soldier once more, his past was no longer hidden. It was alive in every step, every shot. The widows saw it clearly. This was not just a farmer, this was a warrior. The youngest widow's fear turned into fire. She stood tall, her small body glowing with the power of her weapon. When a soldier charged her, she screamed and fired a direct blast, sending him flying back into the dirt. Her tears streamed, but her voice was strong. "You will not take us." The second widow, wounded but alive, lifted her weapon with shaking hands. She fired again and again, her weakness replaced by desperate courage. Daniel covered her, his rifle never missing. The first widow fought like a storm, her anger unstoppable. Each soldier that fell was another reminder of the family she lost, another piece of vengeance. Yet even with their strength, the enemy pressed closer. Dozens more soldiers poured in, their lights glowing across the fields like fireflies of death. Daniel's breath came heavy, sweat on his face. "We cannot hold much longer," he muttered. The widows exchanged panicked glances. "Then what do we do?" the youngest cried. Daniel looked at them with fierce eyes. "Then we survive, no matter the cost." He pulled a small device from his pocket, one of the alien relics he had kept hidden. "This was meant to end battles," he explained quickly. "But it is dangerous." The widows looked at him with fear. "What does it do?" the first widow asked sharply. Daniel's voice dropped heavy and grim. "It releases a shockwave that will drive them back. But if we use it, it may destroy this farm forever." The widows froze, torn between survival and the only home they had found. The second widow whispered weakly, "We will lose everything again." The youngest sobbed, "But if we do not use it, we lose our lives." The first widow clenched her jaw, her voice steady. "We can rebuild a home, but not if we are dead." Daniel nodded, his fingers tightening on the device. "Stay close," he ordered. "When it goes off, hold on to each other." The soldiers charged, shouting, their weapons. "Ready?" Daniel slammed the device against the ground. A blinding light filled the night. A roar louder than thunder shook the earth. The widows screamed as the shockwave burst outward. Soldiers were thrown back like leaves in a storm. Weapons ripped from their hands. Trucks flipped and burned. The air cracked with energy. The flames of the barn roared higher. When the light faded, silence fell. The widows lay on the ground, clinging to one another, their bodies shaking. Daniel stood, coughing, his face pale, his weapon still in hand. Around them, the fields were torn, the barn destroyed, the farm broken. But the soldiers were gone, scattered and defeated, at least for now. The second widow groaned, her wound bleeding. The youngest pressed her hands against it, tears streaming. "Please do not die," she whispered. The first widow looked at Daniel, her face hard but her voice soft. "This fight is not over, is it?" Daniel shook his head, his eyes filled with grim truth. "No," he said. "This is only the beginning." The farm was silent after the battle. Smoke curled into the night sky, the barn reduced to ashes, the fields scarred by fire and shock waves. The widows sat together on the torn earth, holding one another close, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. Daniel stood nearby, his rifle hanging by his side, his face pale but his eyes steady. The second widow lay weak in their arms, her wound still bleeding. The youngest pressed cloth against it, her tears mixing with dirt. "Stay with us," she whispered desperately. "Do not leave us too." The second widow smiled faintly through pain, her voice soft. "I will not leave, not while you hold me." Daniel knelt beside them, opening a small case from his bag. Inside were old medical supplies, some alien, some human. He worked quickly, wrapping the wound, sealing it with glowing gel. The second widow gasped, but the bleeding slowed. "You will live," Daniel said firmly. "I swear it." The first widow watched him carefully, her eyes sharp as always. "You saved her," she admitted, her voice low. Daniel met her gaze and nodded. "I will save all of you if you let me." The widows exchanged tired looks. For so long, trust had been impossible. But after fighting beside him, after seeing his blood spilled for them, something changed inside their hearts. He was no longer just a human, no longer just a soldier. He was part of their struggle now. Morning came slowly, painting the sky with pale light. The widows stood on the ruined land, their faces heavy with sorrow. The farm, once a place of hope, was broken, its fences torn, its barn gone. But the widows did not weep, not this time. They stood, tall, because they had already lost everything once before, and still, they lived. Daniel walked among the ruins, his boots crunching over burnt wood. He stopped and turned to them, his voice steady but full of weight. "They will return," he said. "The soldiers will not forget this night." The widows nodded silently, the truth already burning in their minds. There was no peace waiting for them here, not yet. The youngest widow looked at Daniel with wide eyes. "Then what do we do now?" she asked, her voice fragile. Daniel stepped closer, his expression firm. "We rebuild," he said. "Not just this farm, but something stronger, something no enemy can take from us." The widows stared at him, confused. "We are only widows," the second whispered, her voice breaking. Daniel shook his head, his voice rising with strength. "No, you are survivors. You are fighters, you are more than widows. Together we can be a family, not bound by blood but by choice." The words struck deep into their hearts. The first widow's eyes softened for the first time. "A family," she repeated quietly. Almost in disbelief, the second widow let out a weak laugh through her tears. "A family born from pain," she whispered. The youngest smiled faintly, holding her sisters close. "Yes," she said, "but also born from hope." Together, they began to gather what was left. They pulled wood from the ruins, stacked stones, and cleared the field of broken weapons. Daniel worked beside them, his strength steady, his voice calm. For the first time in years, the widows felt the warmth of belonging. The scars of the past did not vanish, but the weight was lighter, because now they did not carry it alone. That night, they sat around a small fire, the stars bright above them. The widows leaned against each other, Daniel sitting quietly at their side. They shared bread and water, simple but enough. The second widow sang softly, her voice weak but full of beauty. The song carried into the night, a song of grief, but also of survival. Daniel closed his eyes, listening, his heart heavy yet strangely at peace. But peace never lasted long. As the fire burned low, a faint crackle came from a radio device Daniel had kept hidden. The widows looked at him with alarm, as the voice of a soldier echoed through the static. Units report. Retreat failed. Command demands reinforcements. The war will rise again. The widows froze, their faces pale. Daniel switched off the device, his jaw tight. The youngest widow's voice trembled. They are coming back. Daniel nodded grimly. Yes, and not just here. The whole world will soon feel the weight of war again. The widows looked at one another, fear mixing with determination. The first widow spoke firmly, her voice strong. Then we will be ready. The second widow nodded, her eyes shining, with tears but also courage. We have lost everything once, we will not lose again. The youngest whispered. Together, we will stand. Daniel rose, his silhouette dark against the firelight. You are no longer alone, he said, his voice steady. And I am no longer a soldier without a cause. We are a family now, and we will fight for each other. The widows stood beside him, their shoulders touching. 4 souls broken by war, bound by pain, but also by a promise. The night air carried their silent vow into the stars. No matter what came, they would not run. They would not bow. They would rise. And as dawn touched the horizon, painting the sky gold, a new chapter began. Not of widows begging for work, not of a soldier hiding in shame, but of a family born from pain, standing together against the storm of tomorrow.